Do you feel a shiver up your spine from fear? Yes, it's another story from the Nightshade diary. You know what that means. Check under the bed and make sure no one or nothing is there. Is the closet door securely shut? Then leave your disbelief behind. Amp up your imagination and hang on tight for another ride into terror and mystery. And like all good horror stories, just imagine it's a dark and stormy night. And remember, screaming like a little girl is permitted. San Sebastian and the Mona Lisa by A.F. Kidd. It was dark in the little chapel, the dark of places where sun's light never falls. Working by the smoking light of a sputtering candle, Andrea Giotti applied very delicately colored to the wet wall, as delicately as a caress. Saint Sebastian looked down at the painter with his own face, a plain Sienese face contorted in agony. These were features painted as much in sweat as in pigment. Giotti, having spent hours contorting them before a cheap mirror in order to get the expression right, with the result that the saint, blood spilling from his many arrow wounds, had none of the serenity of other depictions of his martyrdom. He bled, he was in pain, he was dying screaming, which was exactly what Giotti had intended. He wasn't sure what Father Giordano would say, however. There was an uneasy suspicion in the back of his mind that the church actually preferred to think of saints meeting their deaths with their faces grave and contemplative and their clear eyes full of nothing but God and Christ, Jesu, he thought, suddenly to paint the crucifixion. That would be something to see, a Christ in mortal agony, as he had had to be as soon as the nails went in, let alone hanging on the cross for hours. Giotti knew how men died. His broad hands, which made his paintbrush look so small, were scarred with sword cuts. He had killed men himself, and knew well the stench of blood and fear and shit and sweat, which was a battlefield. He was 37 years old. These arrow wounds, for example, they came from bitter memory and remembered pain, how it had felt entering his arm, a hammer blow, and then sharpest agony. The sensation of it, arrowhead, wooden shaft in his flesh like a wrong bone. They'd cut and pulled it out through his arm because of the barbs after breaking the shaft off. Giotti clenched his eyes shut and breathed out explosively, and was abruptly aware of smells. The flamy reek of the spitting candle, his own sweat, the greasy sheepskin vest which he suspected hadn't been properly cured. He wore against the cold. The pigments he used, each with its own peculiar scent, like different notes of music, the wet smell of the plaster. "This is the San Sebastian of Andrea Giotti," said the guide, putting coins into a slot to switch on the illumination as he spoke. "It was painted around 1460. The tourists repeatedly gave a collective gasp as the saint's tortured face and mutilated body came into view. See how Giotti painted him as a man in pain, rather than a saint who could rise above suffering. It's a characteristic of his work, but it's certainly not usual at this period of the Renaissance. There's a tradition that Giotti had been a mercenary soldier as a young man, which could account for the realism of the wounds. In fact, he painted very few works, or very few have survived. It's said that he stopped painting altogether after completing his crucifixion, which we'll see in the church of Santa Croce. No one knows why. It's probably his masterpiece." The light went out. He knew how long his speeches lasted, to the second, and he led his charges out of the darkened chapel. "I wonder," thought the guide, whose name was Pietro Oliveri, "if any of this lot really feel any sense of history, of Andrea Giotti, or anything at all. We're now going to see what's called the Scotti Chapel." Several of the tourists laughed. "Peasants," thought Pietro. "It's named after the Scotti family, who came here from the Veneto in the middle of the 15th century, and were the patrons of a number of artists, including Giotti." He paused. "In here is his only surviving work that isn't a fresco. It's painted on a wooden panel and is known as La Madonna con tessuto, which is to say weaving or web, because of the tapestry in the picture. But that isn't the most remarkable thing about her." This was a dramatic moment, and Pietro relished it. On came the lights, and the small painting thus revealed brought another gasp, more odd than the first, from his audience. "I'm sure most of you are familiar with the Gioconda, the Mona Lisa," Pietro went on, almost maliciously, "and the resemblance won't have escaped you. However, Leonardo painted the Mona Lisa in 1499, and this painting predates it by almost 30 years. We have documentary evidence of that." That shut them up, he thought smugly. Giotti's eyes were smarting and gritty. He rubbed at them irritably. Thankfully, the fresco work was finished for the day, but he sighed at the thought of what still awaited him. San Sebastian and his like were all very well, but it was the private commissions which enabled him to eat. So he had not been at all upset to replace the late and unlamented Lorenzo Rossi, who had dropped dead in his studio for no apparent reason, as Francesco di Scotti's protege. But di Scotti was not a man who listened to excuses if you delivered later than promised, and so here was Giotti, ruining his eyesight in a windowless chapel by day and in his own studio by night. Maddalena was a compensation, his model for the Virgin, which was one thing she wasn't, though Giotti wryly scratching absently at his neck. His fingers burrowed into his imperfectly shaved beard, discovering to his annoyance that something had bitten him. More than once, by the feel of it. I might have known this stinking sheepskin had vermin in it, he thought, toying with the idea of taking it back and stuffing it down Beppo Riccio's throat. But he didn't really have the time, however satisfying that would have been, and besides, he'd probably freeze to death without it. It was nearly dark outside, and the painter wondered morosely when he would see daylight once more, then cursed violently as he walked into a fellow pissing in the gutter. Damn them all to hell, he thought, and damn me too for ever wanting to be a painter. Why didn't I stay a soldier? He knew the answer to that, though, rubbing his arm where the huge puckered scar was, where the arrow wound had gone bad. That was a worse sting than the battlefield. He also knew he'd have lost the arm, at least, if that Greek had known to introduce maggots into the wound, to eat away the rot. Much good his knowledge had done the Greek, dead of a sword stroke in the gut not long after. No, thought Giotti, with utter certainty, creating is better than destroying, especially when the simple act of painting, of watching an image take shape at the end of his brush, gave him such intense pleasure, as unlike the bloody fury of battle as he could imagine. He blew on his cold hands as he turned into the narrow street where his studio was, seeing with satisfaction that there was a light in the window. Pietro Oliveri watched the group of tourists disperse, his face oddly expressionless. These tours, short though they were, always left him feeling drained and totally unsatisfied. He shook himself and walked briskly down an alley, which the locals did not show the visitors, to gulp a quick espresso before the next busloads of tourists arrived. As he'd hoped, he found Caterina Gardelli already there, and after mutual commiseration about the awfulness of tourists, she pulled a tattered folder from her bag. "Anything new?" he asked her. "I'm not sure. I'm still battling with this German thing. I wish we could find a copy of the original. That would make it too easy." "No such thing as too easy, and you can never be too rich or too thin either. So how are you getting on with von Muntz? Can I see?" He read the title from the sheaf of handwritten paper she handed him. "The Enigma of Andrea Giotti and the Mona Lisa." I wish we could tell if he was going to tell us something we don't already know. Should be, by the sheer length of the thing. Pietro suppressed a snort of amusement. "Katari, that's rude." She hit him with a folder. Let me read. Here are the pictures I've found so far." She pulled out a handful of postcards and spread them on the table. "The Gioconda, La Madonna con tessuto, Leda e le Signe, by Jean-Jacques Printanier, 1638. La Nutrice." "What? The swimmer? Who's that by?" Caterina picked up the card. "Vittorio Vincenz, 1851, Rijksmuseum." Momentarily distracted, Pietro stared at the little reproduction. It was not one he had seen before, yet the face of the Naiad, or whatever she was immediately familiar. "And then there's this one," Katari added. "Shit," muttered Pietro, looking at it. It was somehow disturbing, disquieting. The woman with the smile sat, as did her prototype, among rocks. Yet she seemed more ancient than they did. And there was a threat there, a menace, but Pietro looked in vain for a reason why he should think so. He turned it over to read the title, which was Der Koning, Der Nacht, School of Van Bork, 1792. It was well after dawn when Giotti awoke, alone as usual, for Maddalena would never stay. He had a thumping head and aches in all his joints. He tried to move and wished he hadn't. He felt 100 years old and as feeble as a child. In the dim light creeping round the shutter's edges, the room looked alien, peopled with things which seemed unlikely to resolve themselves into such mundane things as easels or furniture. The painter staggered to his feet, not at all sure that his legs would support him, and fumbled at the shutter. Freezing air poured in with the day, making him curse, stooping for the disordered blankets. He ended up on the floor with a spinning head. At length he succeeded in winding the threadbare woolen cloth around himself and topped it with the vermeous sheepskin, no longer caring about being bitten, though he could feel something had already had another go. He found half a jug of rather sour red wine and swallowed it all, nearly gagging on it. It brought his shivering under control, and the remnants of a stale loaf helped further. The almost pain of the bites was driving him mad, and as he scratched, he felt his nails take scabs off. Startled, he looked at his fingers and found blood on them, blood seeping down his chest and matting in the hair, and another bite near his left nipple. His hand went to his neck again, finding warm wetness there. A slow realization began to rise that unless he had rats in his vest, it was nothing in there which had bitten him. But he could not follow the thought. His mind was working too sluggishly. But he was certain of one thing, and it was a soldier's instinct, which made him so. And that was that he stood in peril. Something inimical sought his life, if not his very soul. Fighting, he found, after this realization had taken root within, was not something one forgot if the instinct was there, and 10 years as a mercenary had given him that instinct. He was not going to sit calmly by and let some demon devour him. Having made his decision, he turned his attention to more immediate things, cleaned up the blood as best he could, dressed, wearily left his 2-day beard as it was, packed his paintbrush and pigments neatly, a soldier's habit he'd never been able to lose, and stumbled down the narrow stairs into the bitter cold of a winter's morning. Giotti's heart sank as he plodded up to San Sebastian to see Father Giordano waiting for him. But the priest looked more worried than anything else. Before the older man could speak, and before he himself could change his mind, the painter blurted out, "Father, tell me, are there demons that can render a man weak as a babe when he wakes in the morning?" And was surprised to see the good father make a thoroughly pagan sign against evil. Almost he laughed, but it was with great seriousness that the priest asked him the reason for his inquiry. Giotti pulled his shirt open at the neck, and the old man's eyes widened in what seemed sheerest terror. He seized the painter by the arm and virtually dragged him into the church, pushing him to his knees at the altar. "Father, what? Be silent. Wait there." In a short while the priest returned with a vessel of holy water, the contents of which he tipped without ceremony down Giotti's neck. The water was freezing cold, but it was more than that which knocked the painter backwards. He sprawled on the floor, pawing at his neck and chest where no wounds now showed. The priest eyed him narrowly. "I pray we are not too late," he said. "See the rewards of fornication." "I," began Giotti. "Confess your sin, and we shall hope the succubus will not visit you again." "Succubus? But I—" "Lilith and her kind. Demons who lie with men and steal their blood and their lives and their souls." Something colder and older than the icy chill of the holy water washed over the painter, and the face of Maddalena was very clear in his mind's eye. He knew it was a dream, but he also knew that soon he would forget even that simple, sane truth, and be drawn downward into some mad spiral of terror, just as his steps in the dream were descending a long tower, a narrow square stair like the one in the Torre de Mangia in Siena, following a woman whom he'd first thought was Catari, although he could not see her face. Dread lay like a tumor in his stomach and in the hollow under his heart, but he was unable to halt his descent. Once he had touched the stone walls, but they ran with water. Once looked through a gap in the center of the tower, as you also could in Siena, but had been seen only darkness. At last they reached the base of the tower. Pietro and the woman was always 2 steps ahead of him, and he realized that they were fathoms under water, down deep in the deepest sea. In that moment, he was convinced he would go insane if he saw her face, and found himself praying to a God he was not even sure he believed in, that she would not turn around. But she did. She had one hand on the big iron ring, which was the handle of the tower's door, and she turned, and he could not close his eyes. But it was only the secret smile of the Mona Lisa he saw. Still, his skin crawled as she beckoned to him, but he followed as she opened the door and swam out into the blue depths. Wonder overcame fear as he realized he could breathe underwater, and he kicked his feet to rise in pursuit. Bright fish like flocks of birds drifted lazily by, some curiously lipping his fingers, some swimming away in slow alarm. And then the swimmer slowed so he could rise to her side, and she turned to him a face on which Katari's features were superimposed over those of La Gioconda, and smiled. She opened her mouth, and it was filled with teeth like a shark's, and she began to rip at Pietro's throat, while he was unable to scream for the water which flooded into his mouth and lungs. Heart hammering, he jerked out of sleep and fumbled for the switch by his bed. The room came on with a light, and the dream began to fade. Gradually his breathing eased as he was able to convince his body that he was not drowning, although the bed was wet. Pietro knew he'd sleep no more that night. With nightmare's cobwebs still shadowing his thoughts, the idea of turning off the light in that dead hour terrified him. So he opened a drawer in his little desk, and extracting a big dog-eared layout pad and a soft pencil, began to exorcise his dreams by drawing it. Giotti's arm still ached where the priest had gripped it. The old man had more strength than one would think, but it was not this which concerned him. As he squinted at the martyred flesh of San Sebastian, the cheap candles spitting smoky light on his work, and the chill biting into his bones, it was the fact that Maddalena had not returned for 3 nights, and succubus or not, he needed her to complete the painting for Francesco di Scodi. Also, sneaking into his mind like a lizard in a stone wall, came the thought: Lorenzo Rossi died 2 months ago, and this morning they found Filippo Mantegna dead in the river, but not of drowning. Rumor said he'd been savaged by a wild beast. But Giotti was awake and aware now, ready for the possibility of peril, and he had a strong idea that it wasn't a wolf or a boar or a bear that had chewed up the young painter's throat. He paused, his brush just a thought away from the fresco as the cold coincidence caught hold. Anch'io son pittore, he thought, and almost laughed. For all Father Giordano's prayers and holy waters and penances, she's marked me. And is it my soul or merely my body I fear for? Despite the chill, he had to wipe sweat from his brow. Determinedly, he put other thoughts aside and turned his attention to the martyrdom before him. Here, and just so and thus, and the arrowhead burst through the flesh, violating it. In the owl light of evening, he was not at all surprised to find Maddalena awaiting him. But he had a little armor now. Thinking back to all the previous nights, he could recall neither painting nor meat and drink, conversation nor coupling. And yes, he must have put brush to panel. They must have eaten, spoken, lain together, yet none of it lay in his memory. So this time, when she looked from under her eyelids, he did not meet her gaze. He laughed and showed her the wine and the bread and cheese and sausage he'd brought, and refused to look at her. The painter was visited by fear then, how to prevent her from feeding on him. Even as the thought formed, she had his hand in hers and raised it to her mouth. Too late, he tried to jerk away, but her grip was not to be broken. There was bitter pain as she sank her teeth into his wrist, and even his soldier's heart quailed as he saw the punctures they made, clean and tiny. A woman's teeth, after all, no matter how sharp, and felt his own blood kissing her lips. He had a wooden platter in his other hand, and swung it round as hard as he could to smash against her head. Giotti saw blood fly, but realized it was his own, as her delicate little fangs tore out of his wrist. Again he struck at her, feeling the jarring all the way to his shoulder, and either blow would have felled a strong man, but she seemed unaffected. She hissed at him as a snake would. The painter pressed his torn wrist to his shirt, which reddened quickly, and pain ate his arm. He backed away. The succubus followed. "Foolish man," she whispered, her voice like a snake's scales slipping over stone. "Do not deny fate." "In nomine patris," began Giotto in desperation, but she laughed. "Petty words of canting priests of a dead god," she said. "You cannot bind me thus, Signor Pittore. You are mine. Your heart and your blood and your soul and your body cries out for me even now." The painter was miserably aware that she was right, and observed with an odd detachment, as he had done years before, that terror and desire could exist simultaneously, yet totally separately, except where one fed on the other. But he wasn't ready to give up yet. "Holy water closed the wounds you gave," he said. His voice came out a croak. "I think you lie." "And yet you paint me in the costume of your goddess," she said sweetly. Had Giotto been a devout man, he might have despaired then, but words came to him, the words of the only pragmatist he knew, Galileo Galilei, who, though everything had been stripped from him, truth, learning, wisdom, his life's work, still had cried his protest after being forced to recant. "Eppur si muove." Yes, the earth does move. Despite all you say, despite all the weasel words and the petty, the inimical words and the negation of knowledge, still like Giordano Bruno, whom they would burn in the Campo de' Fiori, he had spoken against what sought to destroy him. "But you do lie," he said. She did not speak for a moment, but when she did, her words sank into Giotto's soul. "I need you," she said. "I need men who can create out of nothing. In men like you there is something essential to me. You must know that my food is blood. Yet most men's blood is so thin that it affords but poor nourishment. It is you, the artists, the poets, the men who create. Your blood has savor. It runs thick as cream and honey, and I need it to live." "And I," said Giotto, with the certainty of prophecy, "am a soldier. I have the scars of bitter wars on my hands, and the memories of deaths I dealt in my heart. If you take my blood, you drink destruction, not creativity. I can tell you very many of the myriad ways of death. I am not creator, but destroyer. Drink my blood if you will, but I am more danger to you than you are to me." The succubus wailed then, and her despair echoed down the cold years, so that Giotto, for all his passion, was never completely free of it. In the moment when he knew he had won, he also knew he had been defeated. She had drained too much from him already, leaving him only a little space for the completion of his work, and leaving him empty too, in some unreachable place that made him sorrow for a loss he never could identify. And 500 or so years later, in the same city, watched by similar olive trees with almost identical blue-green leaves, by black cypresses which waved in such a way, under roofs as red and ragged and within walls as cool and nearly white, the corpse of a young art student who had been spending his vacation working as a tourist guide was found, as white as clay because his blood had gone. And a girl named Caterina, who could never thereafter bear the fond nickname Catari, did not know why she wept in the night in tower-studded Tuscany in that newly haunted summer. She is older than the rocks amongst which she sits. Like the vampire, she has been dead many times and learned the secrets of the grave, and has been a driver in deep seas, and keeps their fallen day about her, and traffic for strange webs with Eastern merchants, and as Leda was the mother of Helen of Troy. Walter Pater on the Mona Lisa. The Last Sin by Ken Cowley. "Isn't this the night she promised to come back?" asked Bertie slyly, knowing full well that it was, but wanting to prick Ruthven out of his complacency. Ruthven just smiled at him, but Bertie persisted. "What was it she actually said just before she died? Wasn't it, 'I shall be with you, Lord Ruthven, on your wedding eve'? And she sounded so strong, so sure for the moment, even with the blood pouring out of her wrists." This time Ruthven stirred uneasily, slopping his port onto the white tablecloth. The image thus created took him back far more effectively than words to the day when they had found Lolly at the gates of Ruthven Manor, pouring out her lifeblood into the dust as easily as she had previously dispensed her favors to the then loving Ruthven. Silly wench, he growled. What the hell did she expect? I've tumbled a dozen girls on the estate in my time, and a few gold sovereigns always put it right before. What if she did get herself with child? If her grandmother had half the skills with herb and spells that she's credited with, that little inconvenience could have been put to rights in a thrice. His brow grew even blacker as he remembered how the old crone accosted him in the village street shortly after the funeral. My Lolly was a good girl, she had said, too good for you, Lord Ruthven. And mark this well, I never knew her to break a promise. You are a sinful man, Lord Ruthven, but when she comes for you, I can almost find it in my heart to pity you. True, Lord Ruthven was a sinful man in a time when money and position made it possible for a man to indulge himself. At an early age, he had dedicated himself to committing all the sins. No serving girl was safe from him, nor indeed any groom. His appetite was as catholic as it was prodigious. His parents had done their best to curb him until they had frustrated him once too often, and a convenient fire had left the way clear. Of late, however, he had found the returns on his pleasure diminishing through repetition as fast as his fortune was dissipating under the strain of funding and covering up his excesses. Desperate remedies were called for. In short, marriage to Catherine Beddoes, only daughter of a neighbor rich in trade, if poor in social station. Catherine was 30ish and had quite obviously never been bedded. In fact, Ruthven's only attempt at that somewhat daunting exercise had been met with shocked outrage and legs as tightly closed as a pensioner's purse. Damned bitch, muttered Ruthven under his breath. Just wait until tomorrow night. I'll have you, my girl, so many times and in so many ways that you'll never say no to anything again. And I do mean anything. When one is at the end of a catalogue of perversions, one can always start all over again through the corruptions of an innocent, he reflected. What's that? Ruthven muttered, a bleary-eyed Bertie. Ruthven had forgotten he was there. Oh, for God's sake, get you home, Bertie, he growled. You've got to be standing up for me tomorrow morning, remember? Huffing and puffing, Bertie shambled out of the dining room, across the naked flagstones of the great hall, and on through the back door to the stable yard and his waiting horse. It did not improve his temper that the mare was unusually nervous, snorting and stamping her iron-shod feet until the sparks flew from the cobblestones. Bertie hauled himself into the saddle, where he sat like a sack of coals, expecting his mount to find her way home, but it needed a cruel stroke with his whip to overcome her reluctance. The way lay along a winding carriage drive, through lawns made iron-hard by the February frost, and it was not until horse and rider approached the belt of trees that crowded close around the entrance gates that the ringing silence was broken. The owls erupted into a clamor of hooting, as a wind from nowhere caused the treetops to thrash about. There were furtive movements in the undergrowth, and although it might have been a trick of the uncertain moonlight, Bertie had the distinct impression that people or things which had no right to be there were peeping out at him from behind mossy boles. There was a sense of expectancy in the air, as if an audience were waiting for the start of a play. Bertie's whip rose and fell again, but his horse needed no further urging and flew out of the gates and down the road to the village, lungs laboring and sweat rising off her in a cloud of icy steam. A now thoroughly frightened Bertie hung on for dear life, although it was only the Providence which watches over fools and drunkards that kept him in the saddle as the crossroads approached, and the signposts that had been planted to keep Lolly white shrouded in the ground and tipped at a crazy angle in his path. Back at the big house, Ruthven shared the feeling of expectancy. The master bedroom, where the unfortunate Catherine was on the morrow to be so cruelly deflowered, was at the front of the house, and he stood at the window staring out over the moonlit park. There was a movement at the edge of the trees as a white shape detached itself from the shadows and advanced slowly across the frozen ground. Ruthven squinted in an effort to make it out. A stray sheep, perhaps, from the neighboring farm. But did a sheep crawl? And would it move in such a purposeful straight line? And as it grew ever closer, would a sheep rise up on its hind legs and lift its arm staff, reveal, in the shadowy folds of some material, a glint of shiny white? Ruthven looked no further but retreated to the great four-poster to await that which must come. Beneath him, the double doors of the entrance hall boomed as they crashed back against the walls. There followed a silence so intense that Ruthven, ear straining to catch every noise, had to hold his breath against the thudding of his heart to hear, a minute later, the small sounds he was waiting for, the little creaks and groans that signified the passage of his visitor up the wooden staircase and along the uncarpeted floorboards to his bedroom. The door swung open, and Ruthven had company. Lolly had worn well in the grave, perhaps because of the sandy soil at the roadside. There was still flesh stretched tight across the bone, tight enough to draw her white lips back from long, sharp teeth. She smiled a terrible smile and glided across the bedroom, her arms flung wide to block off his escape, revealing in the process the bloodless gashes across her wrists. As he reached the edge of the bed, she fell forward and crawled towards him. The ground lay flat round Ruthven Manor for an hour's ride in any direction, until the low hill started to climb into a bowl which held the frozen solitude as if it were a lake. It was said that the screams could be heard through the clear, conductive air for 10 miles or more in any direction, screams so piercing that they rose to a falsetto, almost womanish pitch before mercifully dying away. High up at the back of the hall, the servants cowered in their beds, and none dared brave the darkened corridors until the first shafts of daylight arrived to herald Ruthven's wedding day. Only then did Robert, the first footman, drag his reluctant feet to his master's bedroom. Of Lolly, there was no sign. Ruthven lay white and still upon the enormous bed. He looked totally drained, as indeed he was. Robert stifled a scream as Ruthven stirred, opened his eyes, and looked at him. The servant made to back away, but an immensely strong hand shot out and gripped him by the front of his embroidered waistcoat. "Why so alarmed, Robert?" inquired Ruthven sardonically. "Today is my wedding day, and there's much to be done." He released the terrified man and lay back on the pillow, musing on his good fortune. Was it only yesterday that he had bemoaned the fact that he had completed the catalogue of sins? And now here he was, about to go to his bride with the stains of the ultimate sin still clinging to his body, the sin of necrophilia.